Great. So welcome to the Memorial Day Balticon morning panel on the solo novel. I'm Joshua Bilmus, the head of Jabberwocky Literary Agency, which I founded 26 years ago, and I've gotten to work with authors like Brandon Sanderson, Elizabeth Moon, Charlaine Harris. Currently, I'm touting The Kingdom of Liars by Nick Martell, which is a debut fantasy I'm really excited about, and I will let the other panelists introduce themselves, beginning with Michael Jones.
Okay, as he says, my name is Michael M. Jones. I am an author, an occasional anthologist, and a professional book reviewer for Publishers Weekly. My latest stories have appeared in Mad Scientist Journal, Robot Dinosaurs, and the upcoming first issue of Hexagon magazine, which launches on June 1st.
And Ken?
Morning, everybody. My name's Ken Schrader. I write science fiction, fantasy, weird westerns, though not necessarily in that order. I am a massive fan of the Oxford comma, and although the background doesn't quite do justice to it, I make housing decisions based on the space available for bookshelves.
Don't we all? Sarah Pinsker?
Speaking of bookshelves. My name is Sarah Pinsker. I am a writer of short and long fiction. This is my first novel, a solo novel, called A Song for a New Day.
And Melissa, and you have to introduce your friend as well.
My name is Melissa Hayden. I am a content editor at melissallhayden.com and a book blogger and reviewer at My World in Words and Pages. I'm going to put the links here in the chat for you. And this is Abraham, who has decided now, after being on, that he wants to say hello.
One of the things, when I started in science fiction and fantasy, it seemed like every deal was a 3-book deal for books in a series. Not always, but deeply prevalent. And now we're definitely noticing a turn away from that to more of solo novels. So I think, one place that I'd like to start in this is, what is a favorite solo novel for each of the panelists? And maybe talk about why that book has become a favorite, and are there aspects of that which you think might be different if the book were not a solo novel? And Ken, let's start with you on this.
Okay. The last solo novel that I read, and I say it's a solo novel. It's K.A. Doerr's it's the Assassin series is what she calls it. The first book, the name is escaping me, probably because it's Monday morning. She's got 3 books set in the same world. She's calling it the Assassin series. But the first book, all 3 of them are self-contained. One story is going to be beginning, middle, end, and the next book in the series is around a different character in the same world. I liked it because I liked it because it was a lot of fun, to be totally honest with you. Again, it took me a short time to read, and it takes me a few weeks to go through like a single book. So to give you some perspective, I devoured it in like 4 days. So what I liked about it was that it was I mean, like I said, it was self-contained. She told a really tight story, beginning, middle, end, and I was satisfied at the end of it.
Okay, and Melissa, your favorite solo novel? Why?
I was just trying to sit here and think, when was the last time I read a solo novel? And I went back through real quick just to see what books I have read, and I forgot. I read Jeremy Robinson, I think is his name, and he does a bunch of solo novels, and the last one that I read was Flux, F-L-U-X. And I really enjoy his solo novels because he seems to really drive with each chapter. It just moves the story forward constantly. I like my action, I like my like a little bit of hints that he's got in there. And then he gives you a twist in there as well. As the story goes, you get this twist by the end, and I just always feel taken with that twist that he adds. But he always has great momentum.
And Sarah?
I've been sitting here saying this one, no, this one. I wanted to talk about Kindred, and I wanted to talk about Annalee Newitz's The Future of Another Timeline. And I'm gonna throw it out and say Elizabeth Hand's Wilding Hall, which is a book I end up talking about on panels a lot because I love it, and I talk about music a lot, and it's got lots of music in it. I read almost exclusively solo novels. The only exception is probably filling in the gaps when awards come around. I like a story that's told from beginning to end. I want a book to be book shaped and wrap things up, and it might say something about my attention span, or it may say something about my desire for characters to get a rest. I say that as a writer, but you know, if you keep throwing them into hot water, they never get to have a rest. But you can bring them to a resolution and allow people to imagine what happens next. That's always satisfying to me. So a Wilding Hall is about a band that goes to record like a 70s sort of Fairport Convention type band that goes to record an album in an old man, an estate in England, and the creepy things that ensue.
And Michael?
Well, I was thinking about this, and as a reviewer, I get to read the first books of many, many series of duologies and trilogies and whatnot, and I don't always get to read what comes next. So I know how a lot of things start, but not necessarily how they end. So thinking about solo novels, and especially you ask what my favorite is, and I'm going back quite a ways to, it's a tie between Tam Lin by Pamela Dean and War for the Oaks by Emma Bull, both of which were really early sort of forerunners in what we consider the modern urban fantasy genre. And with War for the Oaks, I'm thinking, okay, sure, that is what we consider like urban fantasy in the style of Dresden Files and whatnot with modern fantasy. But it's a standalone. It's done all in one. And I'm thinking now, what would it be like if Emma had decided to go ahead and write 6 or 10 more books in that series? But no, it's a story that she gets in there, does what she wants to, and gets out. And it wraps up.
So, okay. Oh, and as a housekeeping note, I'll keep an eye both in the chat and the Q&A, but if you have a question, put it in the Q&A. So, you know, even though I'm keeping an eye on both, having the questions in the Q&A makes things a little easier for me. And so, Sarah, so is your first novel that's, you know, that you held up that glorious cover for, that is a solo novel?
It is a solo novel. It's connected to a couple of short stories, but the novel stands alone, and I don't have any intention to write a sequel.
And so that was a question, since you mentioned the short fiction, that I was curious about, since you like to really read solo novels more. If we're looking at your extensive short fiction sales, how many of those would you say connect to something else, and how many exist entirely on their own?
All of the short fiction exists entirely on its own, in that it all tells complete stories that don't need anything else. There are no sequels within my short fiction. There are sometimes interrelated stories where there's more than one story also set in the world of A Song for a New Day, but they're not necessarily. Now I'm thinking about it, Our Lady of the Open Road. That may be an asterisk on this comment, but because that is actually directly related to the novel. But for the most part, I don't. They're all meant to stand on their own. Sometimes I expand a short story into a novel, but I would say that the novel is still meant to be a solo novel, in that it's not meant to be part of a series, and there's not meant to be further progression of the plot.
Okay. And so you do freelance editing, Melissa?
Yeah.
So have you noticed any trends in like solo versus series in terms of the things that people are coming to you with to edit?
Not as much. I still get more series from the people that I work with. I kind of, they start with their series and they just keep coming back, because I know all the details from book one to keep them on the straight and narrow as the series goes. But I haven't really seen anything as an increase from the ones that I'm working with for solo novels.
Okay. And Michael, you've done so much reviewing. Do you have a preference for having a solo novel or first in series coming into your reading pile? You just mentioned how many things you've read that you don't know what happens afterwards.
Yeah, my preference, of course, is for stories where I'm actually going to find out how it ends. So, either a standalone or an installment book, that can stand on its own. But of course, especially in children's literature, they love series. They love their trilogies and the duologies. So I'm still seeing a pretty even split between the ones that are aimed at being series, and then you get the ones that are standalones. And there's a different flavor between what you're seeing, the ones that are intended to be serials and the ones that are one and done. So my preference is still books that I can get in, and when I finish it, I'm not going to be sitting going, now what happens? Am I ever going to actually find out?
That dreaded cliffhanger.
Yeah. And have you noticed any trends in the time that you've been getting all of these books between series and solo books?
Not especially yet. I was looking back over what I've covered lately, and still so much of it seems to be in a series or of some kind, multiple books. And on the bright side, at least when I'm reviewing for the adult part of Publishers Weekly, they're more likely to give me second and third installments of a thing, and hopefully I've read the previous ones. So I haven't seen a distinct trend one way or the other yet.
So, and and then I'll go back to you a little, sir, because you're talking to a lot of writers all the time, I'm guessing. You know, they all talk to one another. So what do you hear from your circle of writers that you're in touch with that could kind of inform our discussion this morning?
I think everyone is writing the thing that they love and the thing they want to write. So I think there are a lot of people who read and, you know, who devour a long series and who would like nothing more than to play in that playground. I know I've seen N.K. Jemisin talk about how like all of her books are series because people like to read series. But there are people like me out there too who want to read the standalones and want to write them. So I think it's a matter of personal taste and the ideas, the size of the ideas you have. But the size of the ideas is kind of that's kind of a faulty response now that I think about it, because it's not that I couldn't write more and, you know, after the end of this book, it's that I think it's a good place to leave it. So I think it's a question of what shape you want the story to have for your readers. I think that's probably where I would leave it, and different people define that in different ways.
Okay. And now, how many of you have ever decided I'm not going to read a book because it's the first or second in a series and I want to wait until the whole series is finished before I start?
I don't usually wait. Most of the time, I dive right in with the first book. It is nice if there's more out there, because then I know for sure they're coming and it's not going to take 10 years to get. And then I've forgot what everything happened in the first book. But I don't normally wait. I don't have a problem picking up any book, whether it's standalone or the first or whatever in a series. I do try to follow my series in the right order. I'm a very stickler about that.
From a writer's perspective, you know, there's a danger in people wanting to wait for the next book to come out, because if not enough people buy the first one in the series, then the second one may never happen. Ditto the third. So when I do read series books, I do try to support them from the beginning, because it's an author I like, regardless of my preference for solo novels. I may not read the second or third. That does, like, there are a lot of series that I've just wanted to read the first of, but
and then here's an interesting question, which is but how do we look on things that seem to be solo novels and then they have the sequel many years later? How do we count those? Ken?
Well, if they're calling it a sequel, several years later if it's based in the same world, but different characters, things like that, I find that harder to classify as a sequel. But if this book that came out several years later has direct ties to the original book, even if it's just the same characters, they're older, and then there's a passing of the torch to the current characters. That's more that fits more my definition of sequel.
Okay, Michael?
Yeah, I mean, if you've got a book that is clearly intended to have been a standalone at the time, a complete story, and then the author decides for whatever reason to revisit it sometime later, and it's clear that that it wasn't in their original plan to write a series, yeah, you can do it. It's okay if you do a sequel as long as it's not picking up immediately after the other one in such a fashion that you need to go back and read that one to understand what was going on. I figure the difference between the series and the standalone is, in some cases, a matter of accessibility to a new reader. You know, if 20 years have passed between installments, you should be able to go into this new one without having ever seen the original.
And, you know, what do we think about something like, let's say, the first two Hunger Games books, where you can literally just kind of finish the first one and then get the second one and it starts 2 moments later? Is that like a solo novel that's just been split into 2 parts, or is that a series? Melissa?
I have talked to authors who have said it started as a solo doorstop. It was a solo novel that was over 1,000 pages that they've cut to do 2 books because that was the easiest way to get it out to the readers. But I've also read books that do that, and they really are 2 books in a series. The arc is always growing between them, but there's a story finished here and there's a story finished here. So it could go either way.
Okay. And let's talk a little bit more, Sarah. When you're a reader rather than a writer, you spoke a little about how it really isn't a series. You know, they're not a series because they're set in the same world, but they're unique incidents, plots. Do you feel that same way when you're reading things that you do when you're writing them, about kind of what makes a series versus what makes a standalone?
I think I do. I mean, I was thinking about all of the great Le Guin books in the 70s, you know, that are essentially all one universe, or all one conception of travel and different worlds within that. But the books utterly stand alone. They're not meant to be, you can pick them up in any order, and they're not meant to lean on each other, with the exception of Left Hand of Darkness is complete on its own and is one of my favorite books in the world. But, you know, she thought about some of the things that she had talked about and she wanted to explore them more. And so she wrote the story Coming of Age in Karhide, which is not a sequel. It's just a further exploration in that world. And I think those things appeal to me, the further explorations in the world, more than, and now the continuing adventures of this person who I think needs a little bit of a rest. Sometimes it's a story that needs to carry out over 3 books, but like the last series that the 2 most recent series I've read are the N.K. Jemisin trilogy that starts with the 5th season. I forget names of trilogies, but I mean, that was a story worth telling, and it was worth telling long. And the ancillary trilogy and Murderbot. Those are the 3 most recent I've read, and in all of those cases, they're compelling stories that need a little bit of space to tell. And Murderbot is the only one that's something that will go on and on, I imagine, and I will happily read each of them.
And Michael, I want to, why don't we talk about one of my clients, since I'm the moderator. You've read quite a lot of Simon Green. So how would you characterize different of his books or different of his series based on whether they can be read kind of on a standalone basis, like you just pick one up in the middle, or that they have to be read in a series? And because I don't want to like just keep the discussion on Simon, like what are the reasons for that? How would they apply to some of the other authors that you've read quite a lot of?
Simon's actually a fascinating topic because he's written so many different kinds. I mean, I was thinking about this. The first book of his I ever read was Blue Moon Rising, which felt very much like a standalone epic fantasy. And then he revisited it years later with more installments in that series, but you didn't necessarily have to read the first. But in between, he was writing the Hawk and Fisher series, which were all these sort of fantasy police procedural and locked room mysteries, which again were individual installments of a series with the same recurring characters, and then it all tied together. But then you've got stuff like his Deathstalker series, which is just this big, honking, epic science fiction space opera with so many installments, and that all just weaves together in a way that's, you know, it's obviously intended to be a series because, you know, everything just sort of flows from one book to the next. So he's covered so many different kinds of, from standalone to serialized to, you know, full on many, many thousands of words.
And so what are the characteristics that kind of could be applied to determining, let's say, whether the Dresden Files, because they're similar to the Nightside books, would be like more, you have to read them as a series, you have to read them as a standalone, or the Foundation novels, or just how would you generally apply that to figuring out whether you can just pick something out from the middle and say, it's a solo novel?
I figure Dresden Files, it starts off as your case of the week installments. Each of the first few books feels sort of distinctly something happens, something happens, something happens. But then you start transitioning into things are happening because of the first few books. And by the time you've gotten, 10, 12 books into the series, it is so densely interconnected that, you know, it's hard for a new reader to just come in with a new perspective and know exactly why you should care about so many different characters because so much has happened. You know, there's not as good an entry point 12 books down the lane as there were in the beginning. So I think that's part of the difference between standalones and series is where's the accessibility, where's the entry point. Somebody in the comments just mentioned Simon's Drinking Midnight Wine, which I do think is a great standalone introduction to his style. And then that book actually ties into the larger Greeniverse, but not in a necessary way.
I like the term. And so were you shaking your head a little, Melissa, at some of that? Or was I reading into...
No, I was agreeing with Michael on some of the points that he was making. I read some thrillers that kind of have like a supernatural tinge to them or setting, and they read like the normal the mysteries and thrillers where they could stand on their own. It's the same characters going on different missions. But you do get to a point that once you've created so many books in that series, things are relating back to those first books. And that is what ties it in so much as a series. You're always seeing the characters growing, even if the books stand alone. But by the time you hit book 5, 6, or 7, yeah, now it's a series that's really interconnected.
I think it's interesting that we're spending a lot of time talking about series and sort of defining the solo novel by what it's not, instead of talking about the solo novel and what it can bring as a thing that stands alone and isn't connected to others.
And that is one of the questions in the queue. So that's kind of a good opportunity for you as a writer to talk a little bit more about that.
Sure. I think the solo novel has this, just the shape of a solo novel is delicious, and you can play with different shapes within it, but there's an expectation that it'll have a start and an ending. It'll introduce you to something new, and or to someone new, and it will take you through an arc that will leave you happy to have spent time in that world, and hopefully leave you happy to have spent time in that world, but also okay with moving on to another world. And that one can linger and just live as like a perfect contained, like a pocket universe. And that's the appeal to me, and the appeal of like a perfect short story, for that matter, though now I'm going into something else again. Just something with its own shape that never has to be part of something larger.
And could you give a few more examples of some of the things that you consider to be particularly good exemplars, both in short fiction? I mean, we don't have to limit ourselves.
No, well, I'll stick to novels. Where Late the Sweet Bird Sang by Kate Wilhelm, All the Birds in the Sky by Charlie Jane Anders, The Future of Another Timeline, which I mentioned already. I can look over Blackburn by Bradley Denton, which is a horror novel, but fantastic. The Dazzle of Day by Molly Gloss. There are just so many. They just have perfect shape. I just, it says everything you want it to say, and you don't. You can, and other people can play in that playground. They can go off and write their fix, but you've said all you want to say about it.
So,
yeah. I'm sorry. I like standalone short fiction. I love reading my anthologies, and lately, within the last couple years, I have stopped buying my anthologies, because it's all short stories in large series that I have not read, and they don't give me the satisfaction of knowing where I'm at in the world or getting to know the characters, because they're only playing on what people already know from their series. And I really like standalone short fiction for that. They really make it rich in the words they use to create that short story.
And again, why don't you give some examples? I mean, favorite short fiction of yours that's standalone.
All my books are in the other room.
Oh, you can't remember a couple? Just
off the top of my head, no. I read so many of them.
Because I know that when I started first reading science fiction and fantasy, 40 some years ago, you know, there were things like George R. Martin's Sand Kings and Night Flyers, which still stick with me. And they were, you know, they're the only things in their world. It was a very different George R. Martin back then from the one we have now. Ken, do you want to, you know, bring in a few more?
Well, let's see. One good place to get to get anthologies where most of the stories are self-contained and not referring to previous content would be to take a look at the stuff that, like Zombies Need Brains, you know, those themed anthologies that are coming out. A lot of those on that level will, once they reach a certain goal, open it up to newer writers who don't have anything, you know, that they can refer to. So basically what you're getting is you've got your anchor authors who may or may not refer back to something that already exists. And then the bulk of those stories are all self-contained.
You know, I just remembered a conversation I've had with Karen Joy Fowler, where she said, you know, all of her novels are standalone, and she said, if I write a novel, that's what I want to say about that topic, and then I want to move on to the next one. I just get excited about the next idea and the next topic, and I don't want to write the same book again. So like she said, you know, all of her novels will always be like that, and I think that's close to where I come from too. Like I won't preclude the idea entirely, so no one can call me a liar if I ever go back to something. But there is this joy in moving to the next world and knowing that you've done the thing you wanted to do in that one. That to me is very appealing. The novel I just turned in is a standalone that's entirely different from the one that's already out, and the third one that I'm about to start is entirely different from that, and I just want to move to the next world. I don't want to go back again, I guess.
Also sort of depends on where you're at in terms of it, from the perspective of a writer. It also depends on where you're at over the course of your career. I'm still trying to more firmly establish myself. So when I'm writing a novel, there's no guarantee that if I, you know, plot this out as a series, books 2 and 3 are going to be picked up. It's not a given for, it's not a given for anybody, but it's not a given for me at this point. So it's also, there's also a conscious decision that you as a writer would make depending on where you're at. You know, do I want to risk not being able to say everything that I want to say in this one book on the chance that book 2 doesn't get picked up? So I'm more inclined to distill everything that I want to say down into a single book size so that I know everything that I want to say has been said.
I think there's
Michael?
a financial decision that indie writers make also, in that I think there's a calculus for indie writers where series sell better, and the more books you have, so even if they're novella length, the more books you have, eventually that's going to pay off in this rich backlist that people will buy. And I think there's a different calculus that happens. So it might be worth dividing between, if we're talking about it from a publishing point of view, there might be multiple factors involved.
Yeah, I've published several dozen short stories by now, and I realized I don't go back to the same characters a lot because I like meeting new characters and telling new stories about them. It's only recently that I've actually developed several recurring characters that have, with any degree of repetition. But what I did is I've taken a page from Charles DeLin's early Newford works, where he was writing all these different stories in the same setting. So you always have that sense that the characters were coexisting in the same place. You'd see familiar landmarks, or you might have people sort of crossing over. So that's what I've done to sort of maintain both a standalone. You can read this story and know everything you need to about these characters, what happens to them, and how they wind up. But it's still part of a larger tapestry in the end.
So, okay. And now there are a lot of questions in the Q&A about the economics of series versus standalone. And, Sarah touched upon part of that, which is in the indie writer, the self-published community, they write a lot of books very quickly. One of the things that's been interesting to me in this panel as the moderator is that the numbers, the metrics for going from a first to second book in traditional publishing, getting readers to come along to later books in a series, has definitely become harder. And so there's definitely been more of a tilt toward doing like a 2-book contract or versus 3-book contracts, or to people talking about wanting more solo novels. But the interesting thing in the panel is that I'm not seeing that as much. I mean, it seems to be that people are still enjoying both series and standalone books. But Michael, maybe you could talk about that a little bit more, just, from your standpoint as a voracious reader.
I think what it is obviously when an author sells to, or gets their agent, sells to a publisher, it's that whole, here's what I've got. And of course, the publisher's going to immediately be, and what else do you have? So that's why there's so much pressure for multiple books. And but a lot of what I've been reading lately, reading and reviewing, is in the YA and the middle grade categories, where you're going to see a lot more of these, kids. They're going to pick up a book and they read about these characters. They love these characters. They want more of them. They want more of the Rick Riordan, Percy Jackson, and characters like that.
So is that, do you think, going to lead to more and more series for adults because they're attracted to those characters and they want to keep up with characters that they enjoy?
I don't think so. I think that we're going to continue to see a balance between the solo items and the series, because they tell different kinds of stories and they appeal to different kinds of audiences. And I think every author really does need that, at least 1 or 2 good entry level accessible books. One of my favorite authors who can do this is A. Lee Martinez, who's written over a dozen books and almost never returns to one for a sequel. I mean, he's like a literary chameleon in that he's leaping genres and tones, and he's telling these standalones, and it doesn't seem to bother him one bit. Nobody's saying, hey, can you make a trilogy out of The Automatic Detective? Because he told that story and then he moved on to something completely different. I think the only sequel he's done is Constance Verity Saves the World.
I think if you're lucky as a writer, you get you find an agent who believes in you as a writer, not in that particular work, and you find an editor who believes in your work, not that one novel necessarily. I mean, there are a lot of contracts right now that aren't for a 3-book series. They're for 2 standalones or 3 standalones or 2 standalones with an option on a third. And I think I think it doesn't happen for everyone, but the hope is, I think series and standalone novels, the hope is that you develop readers who want to read your next thing. It's not only that character that they're invested in, and they'll follow you to other series also, and they'll follow you to solo stuff. I think that's what most writers are striving for, regardless, like whatever it is they choose to write at a given moment. Because I think none of us want to be pigeonholed by, what we've said we're going to write in any case.
And Sarah, if we look at the start of your career, when you were selling short fiction, when did you first kind of like return to the scene of the crime and use the same setting or world recurringly?
I have about 60 stories out and maybe 40 stories in. There might have been there were maybe 2 pairs of shared stories somewhere in those first few, maybe there was one early one that I came back to, maybe 15th or 20th. I'm just making up numbers at this point, but almost all my stories stand alone, and that's the joy of short fiction too. None of them are meant to have any preconditions to reading them, including the ones that are vaguely connected. It's a surprise for people who have read the other one, and that they can say, "Oh, I think I recognize this world." But if I do it right, then you shouldn't need that, because I think short fiction should absolutely stand alone.
Right, and so my question is, how long in was it that you first even did something with the vague connection? Like in the first 5 stories, it was 20 stories
maybe 15 stories in, I wrote a second story in a world I was interested in, that was related, but it wasn't the same characters, it wasn't the same premise, it was just another exploration of the same conceit, from another person in dealing with that situation.
Okay. And then Michael, as a reviewer, I've sometimes noticed reviewers kind of like paying more attention to debuts. Is there any advantage to people doing standalones because they're not going to see as much of the like, well, I reviewed the first in the series, I don't need to, pay as much attention to the second or 8th book? Or
I think a standalone might often be a good good way for an author to debut, because it can stand there as an example of what they are capable of, and then they can get more into series afterwards. It's almost like, the debut, if it's a standalone, think of it as their audition piece for their audience. But obviously, there's a lot of difference. You get a lot who come in with a debut trilogy, but there's a lot of risk of losing readers between books at that rate. And you lose enough readers and the publishers might not want you back. We've seen too much of that.
Okay, so we're at 10:50. Are there, if anyone, has a quick final thought, and I'm gonna go to the literature writing after chat for a few minutes. If anyone has any follow-up questions for me, especially about the economics of things. So, Ken? Any final thought?
Yeah, it really comes down to like reader preference. I think we are starting to see more standalone novels because, frankly, people don't have the time to commit to something long term like that now. I did find it interesting to note that the middle grade level is still looking for ongoing series. And I think if, as those folks grow up, maybe that trend was going to change, and they'll bring that, because they'll bring that desire with them as they grow. And we may see a change in the future over whether or not the standalone novel stays where it's at or supplants the series.
Okay, Melissa, any final thought quickly?
I enjoy both.
No.
I enjoy the richness and the standalones bring, and the ongoing that the series brings. So a little bit of everything works for me. But I just want to thank everybody for coming in today.
Yeah, and Sarah, let you hold up your book cover before we leave, and if you have a final word.
I'll stand for standalone novels till the end of time. So if this inspires you to read a standalone, then I'm happy about it. There's some great ones coming from Michael in the chat there right now.
Just a small list.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, everybody, and good
Thanks,
to
everyone.
see you.